Hello and welcome to the third seminar of the COVID-19 seminar series co-hosted by the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation and the Deakin Science and Society Network. My name is Tao Fan and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute, and I'm thrilled to be chairing today's discussion with Professor Ruha Benjamin. I'd like to begin this session by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land with which I'm standing in this particular slice of Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Indigenous traditional owners of all the places from which you're listening from. So the conversation we're having today is a bit different to the ones we've done previously. Our speaker has kindly given us access to two pre-recorded lectures that you've hopefully had already watched. The first is titled Black Skin, White Masks, Racism, Vulnerability and Refuting Black Pathology. And the second is iRobot's Racist, Reimagining the Default Settings of Technology in Society. Now, if you haven't watched them yet, that's okay. The links for them are up in our Eventbrite page for this seminar, so you can watch them later. And the structure of the seminar is going to be more like a reading group than just a talk. So joining me on this call is Professor Ruha Benjamin, along with about 20 other participants from across Australia and the world. Each of the participants will introduce themselves as we go, and I'd encourage those of you who are joining us on YouTube to also introduce yourselves in the live chat. So I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom, and my wonderful colleague Emma Kovar will be moderating the YouTube live chat. So if you're on the YouTube chat and you have any questions for the Zoom, please let Emma know and she'll pass them on to us. So without further ado then, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Ruha Benjamin is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine. She's the founder of the Just Data Lab and the author of two books, People Science, Bodies and Rights in the Stem Cell Frontier, and Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Gene Code. She's also editor of the collection Captivating Technology, Race, Carceral Technoscience, and Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life. Ruha's work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and equality, health and justice, knowledge and power. So welcome, Ruha, and thank you for joining us.
It's really a pleasure to be here.
The first question to kick us off is really, have you had any reflections on the ideas in those videos since you recorded them? You know, I think they're both fascinating time capsules, you know, but one is clearly filmed pre-COVID and the other is sort of beginning to mid-COVID. And so much has changed so quickly, you know, and I wondered if there were any new reflections you have or you see events differently to how you saw them then.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has preoccupied my thinking since recording both is how many of the themes and the concerns that I raise in Are Robots Racist? There are new kinds of illustrations and amplifications of those themes in the context of the pandemic, both in terms of the technologies that are being proposed as fixes, as solutions, as ways to contain the virus, but also even more broadly in terms of what we can think of as the competing imaginations about what actually is the threat and therefore what we should do about it. And one way I think about the competing imaginations is an attempt to narrow the scope of the threat of the pandemic to something that is a biological virus, that if we can just find that, you know, pharmaceutical fix, or if we can find that right app that will help us keep track of who's been exposed, then it'll give us some type of security, compared to a more expansive imagination about the threat that has preceded the pandemic, the many kinds of social and political exposures that creates this vulnerability to premature death. And so with that, you know, really considering the biopolitical context in which we are not all affected by the virus in the same way, you know, and trying to wrap my head and be in conversation with people who are trying to understand the various forms of stratification that are being amplified. And so I guess what I'm saying is that my thinking is not wholly new, but it's really thinking about how it's taking shape the forms of discriminatory design and inequity that I talk about or hint at in Our Robots Race is taking shape in our current moment. And so we could talk about, some more concrete examples of that. But in general, that's sort of where my thinking and concern has landed.
I'm just going to move into gallery view so that everyone who's watching at home can see everyone who's speaking. So we have a question from Radhika Gurur. Radhika, do you want to just introduce yourself before you ask your question as well? You're on mute, Radhika.
Yes, sorry. Hi, Ruha, and hi, everyone. I'm Radhika Gurur. I'm an associate professor at Deakin University. And I have an interest on the one hand in education policy and in the sociology of numbers, but more broadly in science and technology studies. Absolutely enjoyed very much the two videos. I'm quite interested in, the changing status of science. You pointed out in the video that, data is not a savior. Data are important, but they're also political, and they also have, they also create their own performativities. And that's exactly kind of the patch that I've been investigating as well. But on the other hand, there was the March for Science, was a moment when scientists had to plead to be believed. And we are again in this very stark science versus politics happening, particularly in the US. And I wondered, wanted to get your comment on the one hand, science has become like the savior, and there's a problem with valorizing science in a particular way as well. But on the other hand, at this moment, it seems as though countering science is also dangerous, especially because a lot of things are happening in the environment space that is happening quietly under coronavirus, under the confusion of coronavirus. So I just wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with someone earlier today about the seeming contradiction in all of the kind of scientific studies that are coming out. I mean, thousands a week, right? Looking at different aspects of the pandemic. And I think, one of the ways to think about it is that in the kind of defense of science, we have at the ready the performativity of the capital S science. Like, we need science-based answers. We turn to science for the unimpeachable facts and truth. And that caricature of science versus the workaday science, the science that is about falsifiability, the science in which scientists are arguing with one another, where there's a shared kind of agreement about what are the terms of the debate in terms of peer review and so on. And so part of what I think we have to be kind of discerning about is completely critiquing that capital S science that seeks a kind of, unimpeachable, authoritative last word that is often at the ready for people to pull out as a trump card, as it tries to push back against the politicization of every aspect, of this pandemic, but also, make sure we keep room for the science on the ground that is more, it's about contestation and it's about learning and admitting when you didn't get it right, admitting gaps in knowledge and so on. And so that's just one sort of way that I think we have to maybe perhaps not use the same word to describe it all, but I certainly have been following, especially a couple of the really great articles that try to break down why the terrain seems so confusing, where you have one article coming out that's saying one thing and something saying something else. And so how does, someone who's not even in science and technology studies begin to make sense of it? And I think part of it is an opportunity for us to try to, name what's happening in terms of the caricature of what we're taught science is in grade school and the actual workaday forms of science that are already social and already political, but nonetheless can offer, some way forward as we think through this. And at the same time, I think in doing so, we also always have to put science in its place, as much as we want it to be part of, thinking through what we need in this moment. Always sort of keeping an eye for the social infrastructure in which science takes place, and understanding that there are other important forms of knowledge and practice that have to be part of the thinking. So science doesn't just displace that, But I appreciate that question, because it was on my mind just earlier today. Thank you, Radhika.
Celia, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, hi. I'm Celia Roberts from Sociology in Australian National University. I think that's absolutely great. And it's like, yes, STS, science studies, seems to finally have this incredible importance at this moment. And I think people are realizing science isn't capital S science. It's confusing, it's unclear. And I think it's also true of education and of healthcare, isn't it? I mean, we're all understanding, I just had to move rooms because my child's learning in that other room and it was too noisy. But we're all learning that education isn't just, the conveying of truth to somebody. It's this material set of practices where, you have to have stuff, you have to be dealing with emotions, different kids have different access to people who can help them, etc. And I thought in your piece about, the racism at the bedside in a hospital, it doesn't, all that stuff about the real material practices of delivering healthcare matter. I mean, having a vaccine is not going to be the answer, because who gets it, how they get it, how they're treated when they get it or they don't get it is going to matter just as much.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that was that sort of parallel to the healthcare context, at the same time, all of the romanticization and the lauding of healthcare professionals. On the one hand, it get to a point where it doesn't leave any room to talk about the everyday racism that infects the healthcare system. That it's not just about heroes, and essential workers and so on. That discourse can displace the reality, which is, yes, it's about people making real sacrifices, putting their own health at risk, but it's also about people weighing the lives of patients based on these social groupings. And so part of the complexity that we want to name, and that I think this moment is allowing us to shine a light on, is that contradiction, that you can have at the same time people, making real sacrifices on behalf of others and putting their own families' lives at risk to go and offer this particular, kind of care. And yet it's still deeply stratified in terms of who we ration our care for, and so I think we don't have to, we shouldn't give up that complexity just to uphold these certain kinds of narratives and slogans that at some level is getting us through and giving us some sense of solidarity and shared experience.
Jaya, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tao. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaya Keeney. I'm a research fellow at Alfred Deakin Institute. And interested in race and STS and reproduction particularly. I just wanted to pick up on this thread about how racism materializes in these everyday practices of healthcare. And something that really struck me about your talks, Ruha, is how you really grapple with this kind of colorblindness or post-racialism, as it really causes violence in that kind of invisible material effects. And how that's particularly intensified with the kind of universalizing discourse around COVID at the moment. So I just wondered, I'd love to hear your thoughts a bit more broadly about how you kind of grapple with sort of more affirming race-based categories to talk about healthcare and pushing up against that post-racialism.
Yeah, one of the areas that I think it materializes is the turn to automated systems and algorithms to sort of mediate important life and death decisions. So it's no longer the healthcare professional only, but it's a lot of times through these everyday protocols. It may not even be technologically mediated, but protocols, as I hinted in one of the videos, around ventilator allocations, or I'm thinking specifically here where we have this crisis in our prisons and jails, and as part of the decarceration or trying to deal with the overcrowding, there's a turn to risk assessment tools to decide who is safe enough to let go home. And one of those tools, you know, is called Pattern. And, you know, as we would expect, and this is one of the ways that the two conversations in the videos connect up, is that one of the, you know, this pattern, one of the analyses that came out of this that showed that about 7% of Black men were deemed not a risk versus 30% of white men, so that they could be sent home. And so this is just one of the ways that a race neutral attempt to deal with the crisis, you know, it builds on these prior forms of, you know, racial profiling and discrimination, where the person, you know, following this, you know, this risk assessment tool doesn't have to themselves feel any particular malice or hatred or disdain. They might, but they don't need to. In fact, they could have very, you know, laudable social justice aims in their everyday work, but when they clock in and out as part of this larger, you know, structure in which people are using this tool, in the same way with ventilator protocol allocation, you can still be upholding a eugenic form of world building and not necessarily feel like a racist eugenicist in your heart, you know? And so this is one of those ways in which technology facilitates, and various kinds of neutral protocols facilitate through a post-racial or race-neutral, you know, approach. Very deeply, not discriminatory is not even adequate. It's really deciding who lives and who dies when it comes to, you know, many of the pandemic-related decisions. And so it's being amplified in that way. And I think technology is facilitating that in many of the cases.
Claire, did you want to jump in here?
Hi everyone, thanks Professor Benjamin for, you're the one staying up late, we're all on our regular time today. I really enjoyed the talks, and I'd heard you talking about the new book with Marshall Poe. I suppose I shouldn't say this because it's being recorded, whom you ran rings around. I mean, it was a terrific interview, it's fun to listen to everyone. You've really helped me think about a shift in Australia, because we've had very few, relative to the United States, very few deaths and even cases in Australia, only 7,000 cases and fewer than 100 deaths. And the shift in the last couple of weeks has been towards, can we open up, and who's being damaged by not having an economy that is failing or may fail for a long time. And the discussion has shifted in an interesting way in terms of public health to the question of suicide. And in Australia, that's always coded, or it's often framed around white men. And it's white men who can't live up to the ideals of caring for their families. I mean, I'm making a bunch of premises here that everyone could probably take issue with. But so it's really interesting that a disease that is primarily affecting people who are in crowded workplaces, who can't say no to their bosses, who are by and large not privileged people by any stretch. And of course, you know, race plays a huge role here. That the shift in public health discourse is now moving to one about suicide that I think prioritises, and again, maybe I'm overreaching, but I think it prioritises white men in really interesting ways. So that's a particular sort of public health technology, I think, or that you've really helped me think through my objection to it. I don't know if other people agree with me or whether that's a reach, but I think we're seeing similar things play out here on a much less radical scale. I mean, just nothing like the effects in terms of death and disease spread. So thank you for the work. And I'm interested to know what you think, but, you know, obviously I'm talking about Australia.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things that motivates me with these conversations, is I'm very eager to learn how things are taking shape in other places from people who are living through it, not just reading article after article. And so I'm interested to hear the conversation around that. The first part of your comment, though, about the relative number of cases got me thinking, and this again may not apply directly, but I'm thinking about the way that the Singapore numbers were celebrated in the first few months as relatively low, about 500 or 600 cases between January and end of March. And part of that was a kind of celebration of the marshaling of technology and other kinds of policies that seemed that the country had it contained. And then we saw that huge spike, right? Between April and now, it's over 20,000 cases. And so in some ways, in different, I think we're going to see this patchwork of, yay, it's under control in places. And what we know of Singapore is that spike is directly related to the ignoring of migrant workers, several 100,000 living on the outskirts of the island, providing the essential labor, but who were not included in this public health rollout. And so I think for me, the take home there is that the public health protocol, the technologies can all be lined up to a T. We can think we have it all figured out. But if we fail to really care about and include in our collective imagination the most vulnerable and the people upon whose labor the rest of the society depends is both essential and disposable, it puts the entire body politic at risk, and that we're likely to see different surges in different places where, the people who we haven't cared for before, we're going to see again the vulnerability there when it comes to the virus. And so in that case, no technology can save us. The best public health protocol won't save us, but it's really thinking about what does it mean to truly incorporate, integrate, care about, all of the, especially the most vulnerable in our nation. And that's who that is going to vary from place to place. But I guess the point is that we shouldn't celebrate prematurely any place as having it under, control.
Again, a smaller scale, but Australia at first, it was people who had been to Aspen, and it was wealthy people who had travelled. And the most recent serious outbreak in Australia, 2 of them are in elderly care and in a meatpacking facility. So much like the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Tim, you've got a question?
Hi, Ruha. Tim Neal. I'm a senior research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University and deputy convener of the Science and Society Network that's helping put this together. I guess I have a kind of follow-up question to Claire and what you were just talking about is, here in Australia, and I'm originally from New Zealand, and Aotearoa is going through a very similar kind of moment. And I think it's very interesting to think about, on one hand, what forms of work are considered essential, but also on the other hand, what forms of socialization are considered essential, because I think race is also inflected in what kind of socialization we're now trying to encourage or see as good. And I wondered about your reflections on that in the US context, and if tech was giving any insight here, if we're seeing like tech applications that are, supporting socialization in ways that are racialized.
So break down the way that you're using socialization here, maybe an example. What do you mean?
I just mean social relation. Like, here we're seeing a lot of people commenting about just want to get down to the pub or the local bar. I want to have a barbecue, like forms of social relation that are being prioritized or thought about as, necessarily like in these quite, in these kind of white ways in a sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess I haven't thought about or looked at the specific forms it's taking, or it's been so overwhelmed by what I'm sure you all have seen in the media in terms of the kind of back to work, open everything up, white American, guns in hand, storm the Capitol. So either that has kind of overshadowed these other calls for socialization, or that is the predominant expression that is not discerning in types. It's just a free, we need to be free to do what we want to do, and everything needs to open back up. And and so on. And so I think my attention has been drawn to that particular form, that demand, that's really, I think, an anti-social socialization. It's a kind of socialization that's not putting the society first. And so that particular kind of, rugged individualism as the predominant kind of figure that is the loudest at the moment, and I think is in part justifying, or is fueled by the numbers that have come out that is showing that Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities at the moment are being hardest hit. And so that I think that allows a social distancing that's not just about what we're doing in terms of public health, but in terms of the social fabric, and the way that racism is a technology of power and proximity. It allows us to create social distance so that we don't care about all those hundreds of thousands of people dying in major urban centers. We need to be able to do what we want to do. And I think that form of anti-Blackness and, that kind of distancing that allows you to not care about those who are really taking the brunt at the moment, is fueling a kind of antisocial demand on the part of many people.
Yeah, I might jump in there as well. I think that's really profound sort of insight, because protest as well is quite a racialized form of socialization. We see that in Australia it's expressed particularly with, in Melbourne there's an example of, there were anti-detention protests, sort of a couple of suburbs up from where I am, where we have asylum seekers being held in detention in a hotel. There was a car convoy to protest that. And each of those protesters was hit with a $1,600 fine, totaling to about $35,000, I think. Whereas we also had protests in the city recently that were very anti-lockdown and very sort of conspiratorial, and predominantly, it was a very racialized form of protest as well. Which I think were managed a little bit differently. And I think in America, we see that all the time, the right to sort of stand and hold a gun in front of a House of Commons is like one of the most purest expressions of sort of racialized socialization that I can think of.
Absolutely. I mean, in the same week that, we have, people killed for jogging, and where their color is the weapon, their race is the threat, and whereas these individuals can go with, I saw some huge machine gun in a Subway, a photo of that today, Subway restaurant. So, who gets to protest, I think, is, as you said, racialized. And so, that's part of the story, I think. Oh, Tao, you're muted.
Sorry. Radhika, we've got a question. It's from you as well.
Remember to unmute myself this time. Ruha, this is a slightly different question. I've been, I read Arundhati's piece on the portal, and it has caught our imaginations, I think, quite effectively. Lots of people are now thinking about, how do you imagine the post-COVID world and so on. I actually want to spend a little time thinking about the politics of this portal, in the sense that in imagining the post-COVID world and in trying not to drag the carcasses of all the bad things that happened pre-COVID, what kind of theoretical tools and conceptual tools do we need? Because is there a rupture? Is there a need for a rupture? And I noticed I was trying to read in your works, to see what you draw upon, because I couldn't see a very, you do mention critical race theory, and we have kind of opposed to decolonial theories, and we have the tools that have been used traditionally, and I'm wondering whether we need actually, if we were to build upon them, or what is it? Are we still carrying carcasses of things that have done things in a particular way, done politics in a particular way, and do we need a different type of politics altogether? I just want to get your comments on that.
That's a fascinating question, and I don't have an answer, but let me just clarify. So is part of it that perhaps the theoretical tools that we're dragging with us, we need to question? Is that partly what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And I think because, I guess I read her article as it came out, and I've just been thinking about it more in the terms of organizing and more in terms of sort of collective action, and haven't reflected back on, whether we have the right tools for the job, or whether disruption or forms of continuity and so on. And so actually that's one that I'm going to sit with and think about. Yeah, I think that has to be a main part of the conversation if we're going to build on that metaphor, of the portal. So thank you.
Jaya, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. This sort of leads on from your question, Radhika, in the sense that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you talk about as the practice of joy, and particularly as it relates to this idea of racialized ways of seeing. And I love how you chart those ways at so many different scales. But it seems to me that one of the possibilities of joy, as you talk about it, is that it returns me at least to this really kind of situated, embodied place, and a kind of multi-sensory place, and a kind of intercorporeal encounter, which is so often absent from racialized seeing, and as it creates distance. So I just wanted to hear you talk about that a bit more, and about the multi-sensory as a potential tool.
Yeah, I love that. And so one of the writers that I didn't incorporate in the short version of the talk, whose description of how racism works is really, it speaks to the question, because she talks about how, her name is Sophia Samatar. She's a literary theorist, and she has a beautiful essay called Skin Feeling. And she talks about how racism is the experience of being encountered as a surface. And so when you talk about embodiment and intercorporeal feeling and joy as part of that, I see that as the counterpart to this sensation of being encountered as a surface, of having no interiority. Both in terms of kind of a psychic, but also the kind of embodiment. And I think that part of the way that joy is being engendered in this moment is deeply embodied when you think about the various forms of, the artistic forms of healing that are these collective, moments of effervescence. I'm thinking about last night or night before, these Instagram live concerts and battles that have been going on. 2 nights ago, it was, or was it last night? Last night, maybe, between Erykah Badu and Jill Scott, and how you have 600,000 people experiencing this, commenting on it, dancing to it, talking about it for the next 24 hours, and how so much of the commentary is in direct sort of, it's the backdrop is the pandemic, where people are so explicitly noting how this is giving them, some form of sustenance that they're not getting, not only because we're not interacting with one another, but it's a form of being seen beyond the surface and experiencing that through this kind of collective generation of joy and music and feeling. And so I definitely see, and at the same time, I don't want to suggest that this is something that is limited to this moment, right? This is something that I feel like a reservoir that people are drawing on, that has been there. It's just becoming, the stakes are higher now, in terms of being able to do it, not only because of the sort of biological threat, but because the thing that we would normally turn to in moments of precarity and uncertainty, that is each other, that one source of, connection, we're also being challenged and cut off from it on one level. in terms of being able to be physically co-present with one another. And so using other ways to generate that co-presence. It's, I guess, simply put, kind of seeing each other, you know, beyond that, and how that within kind of Black cultural forms across the globe. And I'm sure other communities are also, you know, perhaps finding ways to do that. But I think that that is what I see as the practice of joy, which is very different than what some people call like the toxic happiness, or the idea that everyone needs to be happy or find the bright side of things, you know, and you can't express your sadness and grief. And so it's a kind of blues joy that acknowledges the grief, acknowledges the fear, but also encounters it in a different way that I think is it can be, it's not stifling, but it can actually fuel us.
Tanya?
Thank you. Thanks so much. So my name's Tanya Dreyer. I'm in media studies at the University of New South Wales. Thank you so much, Ruha, for all you've shared and for this really rich conversation. And I'm so glad we got to hear more about practicing joy. And I wanted to pick up in the work that you've shared, the interest in imagination and ideology, and see if you could say a little more on that point. I was particularly interested in the idea that there's possibilities for contestation or struggle, say, you know, opposing a dominant imagination organised around efficiency with ideas of equity and a whole range of other struggles that you point to. And I just wondered where you see those struggles actually playing out. What are the possibilities and the potentials for intervention around imagination, you know, ideological struggle?
Yeah, that's been on my mind, in part because we're living in this moment where it's undeniable that we have this collective problem. And so the proliferation of solutionism and fixes and so on. And so part of that encounter is that even within the realm of people who are acknowledging what seems to be a common problem, there are efforts to constrict our imagination about what we should do. And so even if we talk about, let's say, you know, the examples I've given, like the ventilator allocation and the way that it builds on a kind of ableism and racism, the fittest get the resources, right? And so even within that terrain, what could be presented as a solution is, okay, let's make these triaging efforts, digital or otherwise, more fair so that everyone gets, you know, an equal share of these scarce resources. And for me, one of the things I've been sort of trying to remind myself that is itself fairer algorithms or fairer triaging is a limited imagination, because scarcity itself is manufactured. It's produced through a series of decisions, both top down and sort of bottom up, in which, you know, the fact that we don't have all of that we need to make sure everyone gets what they need to thrive and live, that's the more expansive imagination that I want to push myself and our collective thinking. Similarly, when we talk about, you know, decarcerating prisons, and I talked about the pattern algorithm, there again, we could say, okay, let's make this risk assessment tool more fair. So the percentages of different inmates is equal in terms of who we send home, as opposed to a more expansive imagination, which would be, let's abolish prisons. Prisons are not the solution to the problems that they purport to be. And so again, I think in the terrain of interventions, there are those that limit our scope to tweaking and making things on the surface appear like they're affecting everyone the same. And that, I think, is something I personally have to work to resist, because it seems more pragmatic. It seems like, okay, we can get that done in the short term, but often the pragmatic reform becomes a placeholder, a permanent placeholder for something that could be more transformative. Even if we don't see that more transformative alternative in our lifetime, still, I don't want us to cede that vision of what would a world be without prisons? What would a world be in which true healing and care supplanted the medical industrial complex and the manufactured scarcity that we see there? And so these are some of the places that I've been thinking about how imagination is this terrain that is as important as the policy struggles that I think are directly linked to them.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Ruha. It's really such a pleasure to join you here this morning. My name's Matt. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Adelaide. My question is a bit more of a methodological one, kind of following on from what Radhika and Jaya were sort of getting to, I think. And it's about like methods around activism and research, but also methods around joy and art and practice, and how some of the more maybe traditional ways of negating the surveillance system are now not tenable, and how there's like ways of maybe hacking the system or negating the system. And I just wanted to put that out there as a provocation to see if you have any thoughts or any places of inspiration.
Yeah, and right at the very, very end of Race After Technology, I talk about one art collective that creates fashion to kind of lead astray various kinds of facial recognition technologies through visors and earrings that record the police. And so this collective of women of color have created a fashion lines around that. So that's a more literal interpretation of kind of what your question. But for me, what's really exciting is the creativity that's built into methodological subversions when it comes to thinking about how to use these tools. So like when I talk about the white collar early warning system, but there's also, examples of studies, one that was presented at the Fat Star conference earlier this year, in which rather than look at predictive risk assessment tools, rather for people who are standing trial or on parole, this group of researchers flipped the lens and looked at judges' pattern of decision making and predicted whether, based on their past pattern of decisions, whether they were likely to make rulings that were not constitutional. And so this is a way of, to me, creatively subverting the lens of who we're studying, taking it away from calculating the riskiness of individuals to really looking methodologically at risk producing institutions and thinking about how that may guide the questions that we ask, the kinds of data that we look for, and having this domino effect in terms of changing the nature of the studies that are happening. So thinking about creativity in this expansive form means that it also takes shape like in something that looks like a dry scientific paper, which the end result of this judge study is. But there's so much I think imagination and creativity in flipping the script in that way that doesn't look like cool fashion that's like anti-surveillance fashion, And so part of what I would love us to do is to really broaden like what we think of as the humanistic or the artistic way of thinking about STS, and so these examples are ones that I write about, and then I can sort of link to or tweet the judges study that came out just a few months ago too.
Fantastic. Kim?
Hi, Ruth. I just want to say thank you for your very beautiful lectures yesterday. They were a highlight of my afternoon. My question or comment or interest is sort of a combination of Radhika's troubling of Roy's portal and also the notion of practice and joy. But I start with the virus itself as being represented as a biological entity and a biological threat. And that makes me think of normativity and biological normativity. I'm a lecturer in education and I have a special interest in critical disability studies. So I'm curious about how this moment is a portal into all sorts of possibilities, but how we seem to, and we in inverted commas, because I know there's many we's, how we seem to be not taking it up as an opportunity to query health and non-health and what we understand as normativity in relation to capacity. So I'm interested in the virus as a biological threat and how that connects with people who live lives whose lives are different because they seem to be disabled. I'm keen to hear your comments around how we might use this moment to have so-called normal people start to practice joy in relation to people with disabilities and with, yeah. So if you can understand that, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I can. And it's another one of those that, would you just talk a little bit more, like what led you to that question? Maybe a little of the back.
Well, what led me to the question was I was just so excited to see you included a disability scholar, a disabled scholar and activist, and that in your list of inequalities, you actually highlight ableism in the same breath as racism, and that's a very fresh thing. I wish that happened in colloquial, in ordinary life more frequently than it does, even though it's quite patchy, I would argue, in the academy as well. So I'm interested in the virus, and I feel sorry for, this is odd, I feel sorry for the virus because the virus is being pilloried as an enemy, and the virus represents an anomaly, a biological anomaly. And as somebody who lives with disability, that threat, a virus being seen to be something to be eliminated, that threat, the shadow of that threat is in my life and in the lives of disabled people every day. So I'm wanting to see if we can find a way of reshaping our relationship to the virus so that it might enable us to reshape our relationship to bodily difference.
Wow.
Yeah. And what practices of joy, and I really, I mean, I want the onus to be back on the framing of the virus, which typically is framed by people who would identify, or not actually, because they're never made to, but who would be identified as being normal. So what practices of joy for those of us who aren't normal might normal people start to engage with so that the rest of us can live more capacitated lives?
Yeah, that second one is especially profound. I'm thinking about, the first couple weeks when so many of the disability activists in my network were like, wait, all of these things that we've been asking for forever are suddenly magically possible, especially in terms of institutions. And at the same time, and this again goes back to both you and Radhika's sort of questioning of whether we're actually in a portal or whether we're actually can take advantage of this time, because in such a short period of time, we've moved from making so many, changes, to accommodate the majority. And at the same time, there are plans institutionally, efforts to quickly, let's get back to normal. I'm thinking in my own institution, let's figure out how to get back into classes, rather than trying to use this to make a complete left turn in terms of how we think about our social relations and our institutions. Rather, there's this, it's a strong push to let's figure out. And so many of the calls are, the people who are immunocompromised be damned, elderly be damned. Like there's a deep ageism and ableism that infects the call to let's get back into the classes face to face, and then we'll figure out what to do with the fringes, rather than seeing that no, they are the center. We should be building a world around that experience, rather than thinking, okay, we will tweak the edges. And so where joy is in that, that's something that I haven't conceptualized in the way that you ask, is like how to actually be motivated less by a charity model of disability accommodation, but what would it look like to flip that, where we're not doing things on behalf of others or for others, but to actually tap into something much more profound, as you're describing, in which we realize that we all benefit if we were to reconceptualize, these everyday relations. And so I would love if you wanted to continue riffing off of that. I see you've unmuted. What's on your...
No, I better quickly mute then, because
yeah, that's really its own rabbit hole. I appreciate that question.
Yeah, that was a really beautiful question. Thank you so much, Kim. And I mean, on this topic, I've been following the work of Amy Hamray, who's a great crypto-technoscience scholar, who's also edited a crypto-technoscience edition in Catalyst, if anybody's interested in that. We have a question come through from the YouTube chat, and I think this might be the last question we have time for. So this is from Wilfred Wang from the Media and Communication Studies program at the University of Melbourne. He says, hi Ruha, you've talked about automation and embedded discrimination, racial, gender, ableism. Is there a role the government should play, or can we only count on the corporate market to rectify this issue?
I hope not. I hope we can. That's not all we have to rely on. Oh my God, I'm really late to the game, but I'm just finishing The Great Hack. I don't know if all of you have watched it on Netflix, but it's truly dystopian when you get an inside scoop of what happened with Cambridge Analytica. But my sense of government's policy laws to create the kind of accountability, independent third-party accountability. I think many of these companies are racing to do kind of preemptive in-house ethics accountability that I don't think we can rely on at all. And so the role of governments in creating the context, and also beyond governments, also thinking about other models outside of the capitalist model of tech development, thinking about public interest technology and platform cooperativism as a different conception of how we go about putting technology in the service of these other public goods. And so my quick answer to the question is, I hope that's not what the go-to source of accountability is the, that the companies would regulate themselves. I think we don't have there's no precedent to think that could be a way forward.
Yes, I agree with you there. So I think we have time for one last question, and it'll be from Tim.
I'm very grateful that I get to sneak one more in. Ruha, I had two questions, but you've kind of just answered one, which was about what is to be done. Like in your book, you signal there's a need for a collective sustained effort to kind of almost reappropriate the means of technological production. And your methodology for kind of getting at these structures, as you mentioned in the book, is thin description, where you kind of pay closer attention to the surfaces that are produced by technology. So what I'm wondering is whether or not, in the time since you've written the book, if you've had opportunities to interact with those who make those surfaces, whether they are speaking back to kind of your account of race and technology, and what that's produced, what that's been like, or
I think that's been the most surprising development especially since I started writing the book, but just in the last couple of years, the extent to which I've experienced much greater receptivity to the critique and the kinds of refusal that I'm writing about than many other people are writing about. I was really expecting to write the book, talk about the book, but be quite on the defensive, be put on the defensive, whether I wanted to be defensive or not, in terms of, this is what I think, and then go and duck from the tomatoes, I was sure that I had like my tomato mask already, and that has not been the case. And in part because outside of the scholarly work on any of this, the real kind of devastation of democratic processes and the role of big tech in that, I think, has shifted the public conversation, the consciousness around this basic idea that tech is not neutral. Like, even just that, when I first started, I thought I would have to build a case for that. And now many times, both from tech insiders and many people who prior, weren't thinking in terms of tech justice or why they should care about tech, very much come to the table or sitting across from me like, duh, we know this. Now what do we do about it? It's like, we get it. and so going back to your question, the fact that within many of these companies, but also not just the major companies, but other kind of many like computer science students, people who are on track to go into these fields, are thinking and caring deeply about these questions. I often tell, especially students who are going into these fields, to look at similar, the role of students in pushing, like when we think about medicine and healthcare, one of the organizations that I really admire is called White Coats for Black Lives. And it's medical students of all backgrounds who are pushing their medical institutions to completely rethink how they're being trained to go into these fields, at the level of curriculum, at the level of the kind of internships they do, all across the board. And I love that this organization issues report cards on the medical schools on how well they're doing in satisfying a number of changes that they're demanding. And so they rate these schools, and then students make decisions about where to go based on them, and so on. And so just thinking about not just people who are ensconced in these major tech companies, but the people, the young people who these companies are trying to attract. And I've seen that students have mobilized, for example, against some of the companies that are designing tools, surveillance tools for ICE, immigration, et cetera, that are refusing to even interview for certain companies. And doing it in an organized fashion as a form of refusal, as part of saying, we're not just people to hire, but these are the things that we stand for. And so I see the kind of organizing, both within and outside of tech, cross-cutting, these clunky categories that we have in terms of tech industry insiders, community organizers, the movement building that I've been seeing, whether it's, for example, the group Stop LAPD Spying, which was a grassroots organization that different technologists, helped, advance their different agendas and their goals. And just in the last 2 weeks, Los Angeles Police Department canceled its predictive policing program that it had been using for the last however many years. And so the LAPD will say that it's because of budgetary concerns, but it's through this grassroots organizing in which technologists actually worked in solidarity with communities, right? And so it's not simply, community organizers, though they led it, but seeing the way that students and technologists are putting their skills at the service of these grassroots organizations. And there are many such examples, not just across the US, but I know in Brazil and in Canada. Those are two other places where I've seen this kind of collaboration take shape. And one of the organizations that I mentioned in the clip, Data for Black Lives, is more of an umbrella organization that's creating a context to bring people together, to be like, these are the problems that we're dealing with in terms of data extraction and surveillance and data colonialism in some contexts, and then people in policy and technology actually working together. And so I didn't see that coming when I started this. And the fact that I can just be in service and work with many of these different people is wonderful. And so I think we're in a much better place in terms of the public awareness and the organizing that's happening around these issues than we were just a few years ago.
I think that's a really fantastic point of hope to end on, actually. And in particular, I suppose it ties together some of those practices of organising, of ways of getting through this portal that we can really look to and draw upon, and some really practical things that we can turn to there. And I really thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so that's all we have time for. Before everyone goes, though, I would like to share a slide for our next seminar, which is coming up next week. I'll just find. Which very much speaks to, I think carries on some of the conversations that we've been having here today, and that carries on especially from the question from Wilfred. It's called COVID Up, Trust and Transparency in Contact Tracing Applications. And this is from Dr. Monique Mann, who's at Deakin University. She's a criminologist there. She's also she's either the chair or she's on the board for the Australian Privacy Commission. So I hope you can all join us there. And before I totally log off from YouTube, thank you for all our Zoom participants. So you can wave goodbye. And thank you especially to Ruha for joining us. We really, really appreciated it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hopefully in person sooner than later. Take care, everyone.
Bye.